The gavel came down with a sharp, final crack, echoing the sound of my heart breaking. "The motion is passed," the judge said, his voice devoid of emotion. "St. Jude's Orphanage is to be closed and the property sold to Sterling Corp. For redevelopment." Across the courtroom, my older brother Julian and my sister Amelia exchanged a look of triumphant greed. They were executives at Sterling Corp., and they had just successfully argued that the small, struggling orphanage I ran was a blight on the neighborhood, a worthless property that was better off bulldozed for luxury condos. They didn't just see it as a business deal, it was personal. It was their final victory over me, the sentimental fool who had chosen a life of service over the family's corporate empire. They thought they had just made millions. They had no idea they had just handed me the keys to their own destruction. They didn't know the orphanage's dirty little secret, and they certainly didn't know who I had become. I was a Davenport, a name synonymous with old money and ruthless ambition. But I was never like them. While my siblings chased profits, I found my calling volunteering at St. Jude's, the very orphanage my great-grandmother had founded a century ago. When I chose to become its full-time director instead of taking a position at the family company, my father disowned me. "You are no longer a Davenport," he had said. "Charity is a hobby, not a legacy." St. Jude's was my life. It was a crumbling, underfunded, but loving home to 30 children. The land it sat on, however, had become some of the most valuable real estate in the city. And my siblings, now in control of Sterling Corp. After our father's retirement, wanted it. They used their immense legal power to force a sale, arguing that Orphanage was financially insolvent. I fought them with everything I had, but I lost. The night after the verdict, as I sat in my small office surrounded by eviction notices, I felt a familiar, cold resolve. They thought I was just a bleeding heart charity worker. They had forgotten what I did before I dedicated my life to St. Jude's. I had been my father's protege, his most brilliant, ruthless corporate strategist. I had walked away from that life, but I never forgot the lessons. My father had taught me that every asset has a hidden value. The hidden value of St. Jude's was not its heart, but its history. I spent the next week in the city archives, digging through a century of dusty deeds and property records. And then I found it, a covenant, a restriction written into the original deed by my great-grandmother. It stated that the land was gifted to the city for the exclusive purpose of providing sanctuary for the city's displaced children. Crucially, it included a poison pill clause. If the land was ever used for any other purpose, a fine would be levied against the new owners. The fine was not a fixed amount. It was to be calculated as 50% of the total appraised value of the new development, payable to a trust benefiting children's charities. The clause had been forgotten for 100 years. This was my weapon. But it wasn't enough to just stop them. I wanted them to build their monument to greed, and then I wanted to take it from them. I needed an ally. I went to see Marcus Thorne, my father's oldest and most bitter rival, a man whose company Sterling Corp. Had nearly destroyed years ago. I presented him with my plan. His eyes lit up with a predatory gleam. The day St. Jude's closed was the hardest of my life. I found new homes for all the children, promising them I would be back. As the bulldozers moved in, Julian and Amelia hosted a press conference, speaking of urban renewal and progress. For the next 2 years, they built their gleaming, soulless glass tower. It was their masterpiece, the Sterling Grand. They pre-sold all the units, securing hundreds of millions of deposits. On the day of the grand opening, a lavish party for all the new wealthy residents, I made my move. As Julian was on stage giving a self-congratulatory speech, a team of lawyers, led by Marcus Thorne's firm, served him with a lawsuit. It was a lawsuit to enforce the original covenant's poison pill clause. The lawsuit demanded 50% of the building's final $500 million valuation, a staggering $250 million, be paid to the Children's Charity Trust. Panic erupted. The new residents, realizing their new home was embroiled in a massive, unwinnable lawsuit, began to pull out, demanding their deposits back. Sterling Corp's stock price went into free fall. My siblings were ruined. A week later, Marcus Thorne, on behalf of a private investment group, made an offer to buy the now distressed property and all of Sterling Corp for pennies on the dollar to save it from bankruptcy. They had no choice but to accept. The private investment group, of course, was me. 3 months later, I stood at another press conference, this time in the lobby of the Sterling Grand. Marcus Thorne was on my side. "I am the new owner of this building and this company," I announced. "My first act is to rename this tower the St. Jude's Sanctuary Tower. Half of the units will be converted into subsidized housing for families in need. The other half will be sold, with all profits going to fund the new state-of-the-art St. Jude's Children's Home, which will be built on the top 10 floors." My siblings, who were watching on the news from their now empty office, had tried to destroy a home for 30 children to build a palace for the rich. I had let them build it, and then I turned it into a home for thousands. They had disowned me for choosing charity. I had just used their own greed to make charity the most powerful and profitable legacy of all.